great. I was just going to start my diet. Crying out loud. It's always
There's never a convenient time to start.
No, never.
Where's the pizza?
Saturday morning, everyone. Welcome
we always
to
like
Fox
to say, Clayton, we celebrate everything on the show.
Every food-related holiday, ice cream, National Cotton Candy Day, it doesn't matter. We're Fox and Friends.
Are we going to have pizza on the show?
I think so.
Or should we call and order some
We're
now?
have
Are they
some.
even open? I guess we're in New York City.
Anybody who's listening that wants to bring pizza, we will eat it.
We'll take it.
And everyone knows New York pizza is fantastic. But let's talk some politics this morning, because some breaking news overnight on the Trump transition team. Everyone looking to see exactly who was going to lead the Trump transition effort. And we had heard that it was going to be New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, but that has now changed. And now his vice presidential pick, Mike Pence, is going to be heading up this transition
along with
team.
a lot of the members of the Trump family. You know, Mark McKinnon, who has been following this election very closely with his show, The Circus, he was on Fox News last night. Here's what he said about it. He said, don't read too much into this. Take a listen.
I think that there's a lot of signs of President-elect Trump reaching across the aisle, reaching to some steady hands that have been around Washington. I don't necessarily read the Christie situation as I think we read too much into these things. I think it's rather a promotion for Mike Pence, because Mike Pence is a guy who's been around Washington. He has relationships in Congress, knows all those people very well, much more so than Chris Christie. So I think that's a logical sort of evolution for Mike Pence to step into that job at this time. I think Christie did what he needed to do beforehand, and I'm sure that Chris Christie will land a plum spot in the administration.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. A promotion of Pence, D.C. experience. He's a conservative. Conservatives are going to trust him. National security experience. If we put that list back up of who's on the transition team, a lot of familiar faces. I mean, you're going to recognize with Pence at the helm, Christie, Ben Carson, Newt Gingrich,
everyone that was
General
loyal
Flynn,
to him
Rudy
throughout the
Giuliani, and then Eric, Donald, and Ivanka Trump as well. So a lot of insiders, obviously.
And there's precedent for this. Remember, Dick Cheney, of course, headed up George W. Bush's transition team. He was of Washington. He had that experience of picking people. You're not just picking like a few people. You have to pick. You're really in charge of tens of thousands of people that you're putting in jobs.
It's a huge hiring process.
Some of them incredibly important roles. As Mark McKinnon said, I think there's no doubt that Chris Christie will find a home somewhere in the administration. But also, Mike Pence, you mentioned this, Pete, during the campaign, especially during the last stretch of it, where there were moments where you had people like Paul Ryan, people in the Senate saying, we're a little bit concerned, you know, Ted Cruz, about what's going on there. He would go in to the Senate, into Congress, he would say, calm down. We've got to win this thing. You got to stick by us. And he usually was able to do that. So he's really good at working with those people.
Right. So he knows Washington. He's able to reach across the aisle. But I don't know. I thought I'd disagree there really with McKinnon's take on the Chris Christie stuff. Remember, he's got to go in front of a judge here by Thanksgiving. He's still got the taint of Bridgegate all over him. 4 of his closest aides, even Donald Trump himself, slamming him during the primary, saying, look, he knew what was going on with the bridge. He knew. He was slamming him during the primary.
Yeah, no, you could also argue this is the first big decisive decision of Donald Trump's presidency. Hey, we're going to make this change, shift toward Pence. He's a conservative, doesn't have the baggage that maybe Christie has had. There's a lot of reassurances there.
And remember, he said we want to drain the swamp. We want to drain the swamp in Washington of scandal. Start with Chris Christie, I guess.
Well, speaking of scandal and drain the swamp, you remember throughout this campaign, I mean, Donald Trump was very strong about Hillary Clinton and how he was going to take action if he were to win the presidency. Here's what he said. Take a listen. This is one of his supporters.
So
this is one of his millions of supporters.
Many say lock her up.
No, every rally. Remember, every rally, lock her up, lock her up. Then you had a second presidential debate. He in response to questions said maybe she needs to go to jail. I mean, and talked about appointing a special prosecutor. But just yesterday, there's new speculation that that may not be the case. That he may walk back from that a little bit, dismissing talk of a special prosecutor to investigate. He didn't say no. He just said, and I think it's a great quote. Yeah, it's not something I've given a lot of thought of, because I want to solve healthcare, jobs, border control, and tax reform. If you have limited political capital, maybe you spend it on something.
Maybe these phone calls that he's had over the past few days. So he sat down with 90 minutes with President Obama. And maybe President Obama behind closed doors says, you know, if you're going to go that route, I have the power of the pardon. So maybe you just don't want to waste your time with that.
He had a nice sit down with President Barack Obama. But he also, as you said, talked to Hillary Clinton and had some nice things to say. Listen to this.
Hillary called, and it was a lovely call. And it was a tough call for her. I mean, I can imagine. Tougher for her than it would have been for me, and for me it would have been very, very difficult. She couldn't have been nicer. She just said, congratulations, Donald. Well done. And I said, I want to thank you very much. You were a great competitor. She's very strong and very smart.
All right. Well, not everyone is agreeing with what President-elect Trump is saying. As you guys know, there have been protests all throughout this country. A lot of violence playing out. And, you know, as our own Bill O'Reilly said the other night, this is just disgraceful. This is not what a democracy is about.
Where were they before the election? Right?
Yeah.
Where were they? We know that the voting numbers were way lower than they should have been. Did these people even vote? These organized protests that we've seen with the likes of Occupy Wall Street, we've seen them with Black Lives Matter, these organized, you know, these people aren't spontaneously coming out and protesting. And now we have a third night of violent protests.
It's an excuse for violence. It's a temper tantrum. And you're seeing it in where? Liberal cities, Portland, New York, D.C., Oakland, Dallas, L.A., my home state of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I mean, these they don't like Trump. They didn't like Trump. And they're just mad about it. And watching these celebrities cry as well as into the camera, I guess it's cathartic for them maybe a little bit, but I think law and order may be coming. They're talking about ramping up more protests into the weekend as well.
Well, let's be clear. Everyone has the right to protest in this country. Absolutely. That's what this country is all about.
Yeah, but Clayton, look at these images. This is not America. This is not a democracy. Even Hillary Clinton said at that last debate, when she thought she was winning this thing and she wasn't sure that Donald Trump was going to accept it, she said, we live in a democracy. You respect whatever the voters decide. And I will give her credit. She has come out since losing this race, and she has been graceful. She has been saying we need to come together. This is a time where, you know, we need to support the person who was elected.
Do you think, though, that we need to hear more from Hillary, that we need to hear President Obama say, look, let's turn the pace.
Yes.
Let's give this leader a chance right now. And these protests, they've got to stop. We've got to, you know, tamp down this violence.
Well, what about a joint statement? Some have suggested that maybe Obama and Trump could come out together and say, hey, we understand the right to protest, that this is our country, but doesn't make that right, doesn't make what they're doing right. If you're looting, if you're blocking traffic, if you're doing these things illegally, at some point, we are a country of laws. You have to enforce those. So you can't just say, it's my right to break the law in perpetuity because I didn't like the election where the winner won, you could say eventually 300 electoral votes. That's just lawlessness. You're seeing the manifestation of 8 years of Barack Obama, where they think law enforcement doesn't have to enforce these laws, that they are entitled to a Hillary Clinton presidency, and it's bearing out before us. At some point, you got to stop it.
You've seen, I'm sure you've all been reading these nasty stories about people being yelled at gas stations, you know, after on the Trump side of things. We just got to come together as a country, and these sorts of
you know, we forget that we have lived through months of just a very, very divisive election, and you know, I've been on the road this past week. You have too, Pete, and talking to the voters and hearing about the things that they're concerned about, many of which we've talked about, this invisible voter here on Fox and Friends, and how many people secretly were supporting Mr. Trump but didn't want to publicly say anything in fear of being hurt or being fired from their job or you name it. And I talked to folks last week who said, for the first time, I can actually publicly say that I did vote for him. This is the country that we're now living in. I think that's why you have a lot of leaders saying, let's come together. Even Oprah Winfrey, of all people.
So
you remember?
So Oprah,
you don't expect to hear that.
Are we going to Oprah now to heal?
Hold on, before we get to Oprah and heal ourselves, remember, she supported Obama, of course.
Yes.
But she was heartened.
And Clinton.
And Clinton, of course. So listen to her on Entertainment Tonight talking about Donald Trump and President Obama coming together. Can Oprah heal us all?
I just saw President-elect Trump with President Obama in the White House, and it gave me hope. Gave me hope. I mean, I have to say, just to hear President-elect Trump say that he had respect for President Obama, it felt that he had reached a moment where he was actually humbled by that experience. To hear President Obama say that he has renewed confidence in the peaceful transition, I think everybody can take a deep breath.
It's all about unity.
Everybody can take a deep breath now.
Take a deep breath.
I like that, though, because I think that's exactly what this country's here. And she mentioned the moment that we saw the other day in the White House with President-elect Trump and President Barack Obama. And there's this moment where you say, you know what? Above all else, above parties, we are a country. And this is a time when it has been so divisive, where we need to come together, we need to heal, and we need to start moving forward and start to make lives better in this country. And that should be the focus. So I give her kudos for coming out and saying that.
Of course, but at the same time, let's point out the hypocrisy of the tolerant left. Remember all those violent protests in 2008? They were super violent against Barack Obama all over the country. Oh, wait, they didn't happen because the right accepted the fact that Barack Obama had won. There is an intolerance and a hypocrisy to the American left. They will not accept the people and the people's voice. I think we have to point that out.
But
while
fair,
we heal,
there were
at the same time.
There was some on the right that never believed that he was actually president. Let's be honest about that.
Well,
Yeah.
sure, but they weren't breaking things.
But you're going to have
That's
extremes
true.
on all
That's
sides.
true.
But yeah, we've got to just calm down.
Yeah,
Let us know
that's
your
right.
thoughts about this.
Take
Will you be taking a deep breath? Friends at FoxNews.com, FF Weekend on Twitter. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton may be all but done with politics, but is someone else in her family being groomed for Washington?
Ooh, plus, Caitlin Huey Burns, she is here with a closer look. There she is at the people who could make up President-elect Trump's cabinet. We are all speculating this morning because that's what we love to do in the media.
That's right.
We love to speculate. Stick with us.
I'm kinda over getting told to throw my hands up in the air.
Donald Trump is narrowing down his choices for leadership roles in his administration. So who are some of his top picks? Let's bring in Caitlin Huey Burns. She's a national political reporter for Real Clear Politics. We've got the chalkboard with some faces. Nice to see you this morning.
Good to see you too. Thank
All right,
you.
so let's go through some of what we know. Now, none of these have been confirmed yet.
Exactly. None of these have been confirmed. A lot of this is speculative, but we're hearing from the campaign some names that have been being tossed around. And the important thing to remember here is that Donald Trump does not have experience governing. So he's going to be seeking help from some Washington insiders who have been around this game for a long time, while also going outside the political system. So there might be a little mix here.
Okay, let's start with the Treasury Secretary. And if we've got a shaky economy, who do we hear?
Steve Mnuchin has been controlling the Trump campaign's financial team. So he's someone to consider here. There's also talk, though, of Congressman Jeb Hensarling, who has been chairing the House Financial Services Committee. He's been brought up as a name, and so has Jamie Dimon.
Jamie Dimon, right.
Of J.P. Morgan, of course.
All right, Rudy Giuliani, of course, he was one of
Right.
he was one of Trump's biggest surrogates. Where would he fit?
He has been in the running for Attorney General. Remember, Giuliani has been a very loyal supporter of Trump, and we know that Trump really rewards loyalty and people that he knows. And
What about Trey Gowdy
Trey
role?
Gowdy has absolutely been mentioned, especially his work in the House and on the Benghazi committee. He's become a popular Republican in the House and also someone who's been named for that role. Also, talk of perhaps Jeff Sessions involved in some way.
For this role?
Not quite sure yet, but he's been tossed around for some other things as well.
Another big surrogate, we saw him often here on Fox, Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House. Where would he?
There's a lot of talk about Newt Gingrich being Secretary of State. He's often been mentioned for that role, as has Senator Bob Corker, who, as we know, chairs the Foreign Relations Committee. And he was, remember, talked about early on as a potential vice presidential candidate. But he's been very involved. So has Ambassador John Bolton, who we know from this show.
You know, I got to say, I don't see a lot of diversity.
Right, exactly. That's something that this
It's a bunch of old white guys.
Exactly. They're going to have to bring in some new
Any women?
faces. Sarah Palin has
Sarah
been
Palin. Now, I saw this the other day, and I think a
about-
lot of people thought, really? Is this for
She's
real?
been
Or is this
talked
an internet
about
meme?
as Interior Secretary. There have been other names tossed around, but she's been wanting a job in this administration. She's made clear. It's not clear, though, whether she will be picked.
So Interior Secretary, what does that do? National Park Service?
Right, exactly, and so that could fit her. The position that I'm looking most closely at, and I think is one of the most important decisions the president makes, is Chief of Staff. This is someone who has
One of the most
president's
important
ear.
roles.
One of the most important roles. It's very behind the scenes, and a lot of people don't really know, don't really focus on that. But this is someone who's going to be key in running the president's schedule, making those relationships with Congress. So there are two people that have been in the news being considered. Reince Priebus, of course, who was the RNC chair, still is, has been very key in establishing those alliances with the Republican establishment and party, and that could be very valuable to someone like Trump who doesn't have necessarily those connections. However, there's also talk of Steve Bannon, who was his campaign
From Breitbart
chairman
News.
of Breitbart News, and that would be an extremely controversial pick, and that would signal that he's not very interested in unifying the party and unifying both parties and establishing some kind of peace and calm on Capitol Hill.
Yeah. Do you think that's going to happen?
It would it would be very surprising. But we know that he's been very close to Trump, has been advising him throughout this campaign. I think Reince Priebus is someone that everybody in Washington kind of hopes he goes towards.
Somebody else we saw, and obviously he ran against him, but then he came out supporting him, and he was a pretty vocal supporter, was Governor Mike Huckabee.
Yeah,
Where
there's
did
some
he fit?
talk about Huckabee being Commerce Secretary. Of course, Huckabee was a former governor, also ran for president a few times. He's been talked about.
What about Kellyanne Conway?
So Kellyanne Conway is someone I envision more in a communications role. Remember, she was the campaign chair, she ran the campaign, but she was very much the messenger and the face of the campaign. So somewhere, maybe not in the cabinet, but somewhere perhaps as communications director, secretary, really being in charge of the message and controlling that message, I think would be a good role for her. Ben Carson has been talked about perhaps as Health and Human Services Secretary, or there's even been talk of him as Secretary of Education. And I would just move him down to this role because that's been talked about most likely, although Trump and other Republicans have talked about diminishing the role of the Education Department. So we'll see.
And finally, Chris Christie, I mean, you know, if you want to drain the swamp in Washington, you've been talking about that as Trump has, and now we know that he's not heading up his transition team. Is he out?
Right. I think it would be very controversial to bring Christie into this administration, given everything that's going on, that has been going on with Bridgegate. Trump ran against a scandal in the White House, and it would be very difficult for him to bring someone in. Governor Rick Scott has been talked about for Health and Human Services before, and you know we still have Michael Flynn as perhaps Defense Secretary.
All right, coming up, playing on the transition team bingo. We'll be playing that later this afternoon. Caitlin Huey-Burns, great to see you this morning.
Good to see you too. Thanks.
All right, a third night of anti-Trump protests spreading across the country. Is it time for President Obama to call for calm? David Webb and Danielle McLaughlin are here for a fair and balanced debate. That's next. And it was one of President-elect's favorite targets in the corrupt mainstream media.
I put down failing at New York Times. The newspaper's going to hell. Maybe we'll start thinking about taking their press credentials away from them.
Well, this morning, the Times, right? So he knows Washington. He's able to reach across the aisle. But I don't know. I thought I'd disagree there really with McKinnon's take on the Chris Christie stuff. Remember, he's got to go in front of a judge here right by Thanksgiving. He's still got the taint of Bridgegate all over him. 4 of his closest aides, even Donald Trump himself, slamming him during the primary, saying, "Look, he knew what was going on with the bridge. He knew. He was slamming him during the primary."
Yeah, no, you could also argue this is the first big decisive decision of Donald Trump's presidency. Hey, we're going to make this change, shift toward Pence. He's a conservative, doesn't have the baggage that maybe Christie has had. There's a lot of reassurances there.
And Washington, he has relationships in Congress, knows all those people very well, much more so than Chris Christie. So I think that's a logical sort of evolution for Mike Pence to step into that job at this time. I think Christie did what he needed to do beforehand, and I'm sure that Chris Christie will land a plum spot in the administration.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. A promotion of Pence, D.C. experience. He's a conservative. Conservatives are going to trust him. National security experience. If we put that list back up of who's on the transition team, a lot of familiar faces. I mean, you're going to recognize with Pence at the helm, Christie, Ben Carson, Newt Gingrich,
everyone that was
General
loyal
Flynn,
to him,
Rudy Giuliani, and then Eric, Donald, and Ivanka Trump as well. So a lot of insiders, obviously.
And there's precedent for this. Remember, Dick Cheney, of course, headed up George W. Bush's transition team. He was of Washington. He had that experience of picking people. You're not just picking like a few people. You have to pick. You're really in charge of tens of thousands of people.
It's a huge hiring process.
Some of them incredibly important roles. As Mark McKinnon said, I think there's no doubt that Chris Christie will find a home somewhere in the administration. But also, Mike Pence, you mentioned this, Pete, during the campaign, especially during the last stretch of it, where there were moments where you had people like Paul Ryan, people in the Senate saying, we're a little bit concerned, you know, Ted Cruz, about what's going on there. He would go in to the Senate, into Congress, he would say, calm down, we've got to win this thing, you've got to stick by us. And he usually was able to do that. So he's really good at working with those people.
Great. I was just going to start my diet. Crying out loud. It's always
It's never a convenient time to start.
No, never.
Where's the pizza?
Saturday morning, everyone. Welcome
we always
to Fox
like to say, Clayton, we celebrate everything on the show.
Every food-related holiday, ice cream, National Cotton Candy Day, it doesn't matter. We're Fox and Friends.
Are we going to have pizza on the show?
I think so.
Or should we call and order some now? Are they even open? I guess we're in New York City.
Anybody who's listening that wants to bring pizza, we will eat it.
We'll take it.
And everyone knows New York pizza is fantastic. But let's talk some politics this morning, because some breaking news overnight on the Trump transition team. Everyone looking to see exactly who is going to lead the Trump transition effort. And we had heard that it was going to be New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, but that has now changed. And now his vice presidential pick, Mike Pence, is going to be heading up this transition
along with
team.
a lot of the members of the Trump family. You know, Mark McKinnon, who has been following this election very closely with his show, The Circus, he was on Fox News last night. Here's what he said about it. He said, don't read too much into this. Take a listen.
I think that there's a lot of signs of President-elect Trump reaching across the aisle, reaching to some steady hands that have been around Washington. I don't necessarily read the Christie situation as, I think we read too much into these things. I think it's rather a promotion for Mike Pence, because Mike Pence is a guy who's been around